Good morning, everybody. As people join, we'll be starting in a few minutes. We're just letting everybody click in and join us. Back in a minute or two. Good morning, everybody. We have lots of people joining. We're just going to wait another minute and let people continue to come in. Good morning, everyone. We continue to have people joining. We'll start in 1 minute, though. We'll start in 1 minute. Thank you. Lovey, ready to go?
Let's get started.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Joe Haggerty. I'm CEO of the Alexandria Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us on Zoom this morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 State of Business Awards presented by Truist. Many of you know our mission is supporting business and cultivating community. And at this meeting, we're going to report to you on what the economics look like in the community. Last year, we looked at development, and we were happily celebrating Amazon and Virginia Tech announcing their major announcements to move here and to offer thousands of new jobs. This year, we'll take a look at the current economy on pretty much of a regional basis. And we'll also be talking a little bit about capital because the need for capital, especially among mid and small sized business, has been emphasized by many people who have talked to us in terms of their future to keep their business going. Board Chairman Dave Millard will later on in the meeting talk and give a chamber update, and we'll tell you about some board members that are leaving us and some new board members that are joining. Right now, I'd like to welcome a couple of electeds who have joined us this morning. We have Councilwoman Amy Jackson and Councilman John Chapman are joining us. Also joining is City Manager Mark Jenks, so we welcome all of them. In terms of past chairs of the Chamber of Commerce, we have Charlotte Hall with us, we have Jen Kinnaman, and we have John Renner, all past chairmen and chairmen and women of the Chamber of Commerce. In terms of sponsors, I just want to thank Green Hill Realty, United Way Worldwide, Kinnaman Insurance, Totten Properties, and of course, Truist. Truist has been our sponsor for the last number of years, and we put this meeting together in working with them on a cooperative basis. so that we can bring you the latest information. So right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Cassius Priestley, who is a board member of the Alexandria Chamber of Commerce. He's market president of commercial banking at Truist. Cassius?
Thanks, Joe, and good morning, everyone. As mentioned earlier, my name is Cassius Priestley. I am the market president for Truist in the Alexandria, Arlington, and DC markets. As many of you know,
Hey, Cassius,
Truist,
I don't think your camera's on. If you could click yourself on. There you are. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's try this again. Good morning. As many of you know, Truist is the merger of SunTrust and BB&T. I want to first congratulate the outgoing board members and commend the incoming board members for accepting the challenge. The Alexandria Chamber continues to advocate for local businesses. Their advocacy includes ensuring there is a business-friendly environment from a legislative perspective to informing and educating businesses on how to remain viable in the middle of a pandemic. The Chamber is there. Just as the Chamber is there, Truist is there. From the $50 million in COVID relief through Truist Cares, $60 billion through our community investment announced before COVID-19, are the $12 billion in PPP loans, which ranks us fourth in the country in total PPP loans. More specifically, $1.6 billion PPP loans in Greater Washington, which ranks us number one in the region. Truist is committed to being a part of the community and living out our purpose of inspiring and building better lives and communities. Over the past 2 years, this event has featured panels on commercial developments in Alexandria and Northern Virginia at large. This year, we have invited Jeanette Chapman of George Mason University and Philip Avent with Truist to discuss the state of the economy in the face of the coronavirus. Jeanette Chapman is the director of the Stephen S. Fuller Institute in the Scar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. At the Institute, she examines the Washington region's economic, demographics, and housing markets. Jeanette has been with George Mason University since 2013. Prior to joining George Mason University, she was a research associate for economic growth and development in the downtown DC Business Improvement District, where she analyzed the major sectors of the downtown DC economy. Jeanette received bachelor degrees in economics and foreign affairs from the University of Virginia and a master's degree in public policy from George Mason University. Philip currently serves as Senior Vice President on Truist Capital Markets Origination Team. As a member of the bank's commercial community banking industry specialty and advisory organization, Philip has responsibility for the origination of capital markets and investment banking transactions and partners with local teams to jointly position advisory-based solutions. These solutions help the bank clients meet their goals by maximizing enterprise value. Philip has been with SunTrust, now Truist, since 1999 in both relationship management and product roles across industries. Please welcome Jeanette Chapman.
Good morning, everyone. In about 20 minutes, I am going to cover pretty much everything that I can about the pandemic, its effect on the regional economy, its effect on the Northern Virginia economy, and a little bit of a forecast. So I'm going to move through pretty quickly, and I'm going to start actually by talking about the pandemic specific trends. You can't really discuss what's going on in the economy without first looking at the COVID trends locally. Our first wave occurred in mostly between April and May. The sub-state area rates, after adjusting for population, were fairly similar, and they've continued to be fairly similar. Our rates came down in July and stayed relatively low until the end of October, which is when we started our true second wave. Nationally, when you look at the data, usually you're looking at the aggregated national statistics, and it looks like there are 3 waves. That's not exactly true. I've separated this into a handful of metro areas, looking at the largest 15 metro areas, of which we are one. And this is a good representation of how most areas have experienced their COVID patterns. There were about 6 major metros, including us, that had early first waves. And you can see that in the blue line, and then we are shown in the red. And those first waves peaked really in somewhere between April and May. The next 9 major metros didn't have their first wave until summer. And so on the national chart, it kind of looked like there was a second wave happening. However, there wasn't a second wave that was happening within each locality. It was really just a change of location of where the COVID was hitting hardest. Then that narrative changed a little bit, or the situation changed a little bit in late October, which is when various metro areas started to have true second waves. Most metro areas have had second waves. You have to kind of drill in to see who's had different degrees, but in general, there was a first wave from pretty much everywhere that happened prior to October, and then there's a second wave that happened in October. And the reason that this matters is because it actually affects how the economy is functioning and how consumers have changed their patterns. And I like to look at the open table reservation chart just as an example of how people have reacted to the pandemic. Mainly that things that we used to think were safe and didn't think anything about doing were no longer things that we could do kind of mindlessly. We needed to put in a little bit of extra effort, or we didn't know how safe they were. And so people reacted accordingly. People changed their demand patterns based off of what was deemed safe and appropriate at the time. And early in the pandemic, as you can see on the open table reservations chart, most regions reacted the same, or most people in regions reacted the same, regardless of what their local COVID rates were. Early in the pandemic, it looks like most consumers were looking at what was happening either in New York or internationally. So you can see that the change in reservations, I'm showing DC, Miami, and the US average. The change in reservations fell off pretty much at the same pace, and they fell off before policy interventions happened. The people reacted very sharply to what was going on or what they thought was going on. This also has changed on the reopening side. After we kind of learned a little bit more about what COVID was and how it was manifesting in our local communities, it seems as if most consumers changed their focus away from this national picture and towards their local communities when the reopening started. And so the reopening side and what has happened since then has had varying degrees of recovery, primarily tied to what was going on with the COVID trends in the region or in their area. And so I will point to Miami first. When Miami reopened, they were a late second wave. And so they hadn't actually had their first wave by the time that they reopened restaurants. You can see that there's almost a vertical spike in demand when the reopening happened that was quite sharp and very immediate, followed by a very quick recovery, because at that time, the health metrics deemed a lot of activities to be very safe. That reversed in June, late June and early July, when they had their second wave. And so you can see that demand, some of this is a policy intervention, but a lot of this is actually just a natural decrease in demand because it wasn't safe anymore. Now, by contrast, when DC reopened in late May, our rates were still somewhat elevated, and we hadn't seen this huge drop off in rates. Our decrease wasn't a discrete pivot. We had a slower decline in our COVID rate decrease, and the consumer demand patterns reflect that. So you don't see a big spike in demand. You can't even see where the reopening phases really happened because our reopening pattern has been very slow and incremental. And in some ways, the policy interventions are happening or the policy reopening is happening before any major shifts in demand are happening, which is why we're not seeing these major spikes. And in general, just if you need to categorize our region compared to other regions, it seems like the people in our region are a little bit more risk averse and a little bit more cautious when it comes to coming back into the consumer spending service market. And you can see that pretty clearly on this chart where there's been a slow and steady increase, even from DC specific restaurants. All of this has changed consumer spending in aggregate. And this is credit and debit card spending for select areas in our region. Starting in February, there's been just a tremendous decrease compared to January in April and in May. All counties in our region pretty much had a drop off of between 40 and 50%. And the recovery since then probably has been a function of two different things when looking at your residents. And it's how much of your residential spending was based on consumer services to begin with. So younger households typically spend more on consumer services like entertainment and restaurants and things along those lines. And older households tend not to. So you can see DC and Arlington have had lower rates of recovery, but also the net wealth plays a role in this as well, where households that tended to be better off were less affected in their consumer spending. In addition to the overall change in the decreased change in consumer spending, there's a change in the composition of spending. And in general, consumer-oriented services took the largest hit, whereas consumer goods were a little bit more resilient. And you can see this is for DC residents. I don't have the Alexandria or Northern Virginia breakout of this, but the relative trends will be comparable, where the largest declines and the least recovered types of spending are transportation, accommodation, and food services at the bottom two lines. Whereas general merchandise and apparel had less of a decrease and a little bit more of a recovery since then. And grocery and food obviously has had a big bump up. Not in this chart are things like durable goods sales and housing sales. Those both recovered fairly quickly, both nationally and within our region. And so the big ticket items that are kind of thinking 5 or 10 years out, people were still purchasing. It's the consumable services that took the largest hit. All of this translated to job losses, both nationally and within the region. And this chart compares the regional job losses to our prior recessions that had major job declines. And between February and May, our region lost 10.7% of its job space, which is just ridiculous. We haven't seen anything like that before. Since then, we've recovered by about 35, 40-ish%. And but even that is still almost twice as severe as any other magnitude of job losses that we've had. Compared to the other peer metros, the other largest metros, I've categorized them again based off of when their COVID first wave hit. The first wave, the metros that had their first wave earlier had the deepest decrease, the sharpest decrease, but have also had the most consistent recovery. The metros that were affected later in green tended to have less declines early on, but have also had more stagnation in their recovery. And some of them have actually reversed because they had their second wave in July. We've done fairly well compared to these metros, but it's not great. It isn't like the last recession where we were really still growing during the last recession by some metrics. This recession, we were able to retain quite a large number of our jobs given the nature of what we do here, but our recovery has been relatively slow. The main story on an industry composition component is the leisure and hospitality sector. You can see that's the largest decrease on a percentage point basis through October. The decrease here accounts for about half of the overall jobs losses. So you can kind of shorthand some of this as a leisure and hospitality story. The second largest percentage decline was in transportation and utilities. This is mostly transportation. And then the third largest decrease is the education and health. This is private sector health, not outside of hospitals. So these are ambulatory care, these are elective services, these are physical therapists, these are dentists, things along those lines. I will want to highlight that the bump that you see in the federal government is most likely temporary because of the decennial census. There are still a large number of kind of summer workers that are staying into this data set. In November, we'll start to see them fall off. The two other gains that you see in construction and wholesale trade are not, they're one time. This is the first time on a year-over-year basis that they've increased, and it's probably not necessarily indicative of a longer term trend. It's just a sort of a fall noise almost. Within the Washington region, All of the sub-state areas have had significant decreases and about the same rate of recovery. There's some differences based on the industrial structure. That's really the main difference between these areas, and a little bit about kind of how much of their typical consumer base is based off of tourism. So DC in some ways had a larger tourism hit, but was bolstered by other factors. Northern Virginia, you can see, is kind of had a relatively small decrease compared to some of the other sub-state areas, the other two sub-state areas, and had a slightly stronger recovery. But again, this is marginal, and it's not necessarily indicative of any sort of COVID-specific strength or weakness. As just like with the Washington region, the largest absolute and the largest percentage decreases are in the leisure and hospitality sector. Leisure and hospitality is down significantly, just like it is within the Washington region. The several things that are different in Northern Virginia than the regional average overall. The professional and business service sector has started to grow again in Northern Virginia on a year-over-year basis. Regionally, it's still doing quite well, but not all of the sectors growing. It's still regionally administrative and wage services are still down. And so, but Northern Virginia has been able to kind of turn the corner on that. The federal government blip, again, is just a one more sort of temporary bump up. And so I don't read into that. But the construction increase is actually quite strong. Unfortunately, like with the regional story, construction data in the fall get noisy because of weather effects. And actually last fall, we had some weak construction data. So this is actually a reflection on how weak last year was, not because of how good this year is. But there are two bright spots in this picture. Actually, at the very bottom of the chart, the information services in the manufacturing sectors have done actually quite well in Northern Virginia. It's not a ton of jobs, but these are the sectors in our region that actually were able to benefit from the pandemic. Information services includes Zoom and all of the softwares that we're using and all of the data services that we need. And the manufacturing in our region tends to be a little bit more tech oriented. So we're manufacturing chips and things along those lines. On a percentage point basis, this is what it looks like. And you can see, aside from the gains, there are some similarities with what it looks like on the regional side, where we're still down almost 22% of the leisure and hospitality jobs, 18% of our transportation jobs, and 10% of our education and health service jobs. So these, again, are unprecedented decreases that reflect a near shutdown condition of those sectors in particular. Other services is also a part of this picture. Other services includes personal care and maintenance and things along those lines. There are three major trends, though, that aren't shown in the job charts. And they're things that we kind of already know. But the first major trend that is kind of changing our economy as we know it right now is that we've been able to send a lot of our workers home. As I've mentioned, we could actually preserve a large number of our jobs by doing that. We were able to retain our production capacity. The knowledge service industries tend to do fairly well with sending their workers home in general, because our brains still function at home. We don't need stuff to work. And when you compare us to the other largest metros, we rank either number 1 or 2, sometimes San Francisco, depending on the week that you're looking at, outranks us, but we are significantly higher in this metric than many others. The flip side of this is, though, that the consumer services recovery will be slower. Workers spend a lot of money when they are going out to lunch, when they're going to happy hours as part of kind of the work rituals, and we're not going to be doing that until we're back in the office. And so we're going to continue to have this slower recovery on the consumer services side. The second major issue that's not showing up in the jobs data, and I'm not going to go into this too much, but there are changes in productivity on a per job basis. Usually you can kind of extrapolate what the economy is doing based off of what the jobs are doing, and that picture is a little bit fuzzier. The major winner, as I mentioned already, is the information services industry, which was able to be much more productive or get a lot more revenue without having to scale up its workers or the number of jobs proportionally, because it already has all the investments done. It just needed to get in more clients. The retail trade bump is actually a pre-pandemic trend. So again, don't read into that too much, where retail trade has been slowly changing out its workers for technology. This trend has been happening for about 2 years. Now, on the other side of this chart, the leisure and hospitality and transportation in particular stories are actually worse than the jobs chart would indicate. And that is because it appears that the workers that they retained are probably working far fewer hours than they were pre-pandemic. And so the payroll numbers are getting diluted. And when you think about the leisure and hospitality or transportation revenues, those have dropped off by significantly more. The last thing that I will talk about on this chart is that the professional, scientific, technical, and management service jobs also had a decrease in productivity through second quarter. That's probably the adjustment to working from home. And I don't have data on more recent data to know whether or not that decrease is permanent. I'm guessing that some of it is permanent because we are, by and large, there are things that we're not efficient with. And I think we can all kind of think through, we all do our own admin, we all have tech issues that we're kind of troubleshoot on our own. But there are reasons to believe that we are not as productive across the board by working from home. The last thing that I'm going to briefly touch on is the situation on the labor force side, where one of the problems that is going to be emerging as we recover or as we continue to recover is that a large number of our pandemic affected workers left the labor force. So they're not showing up as unemployed. The delta that you see shown by that red dash is the number of workers that left our labor force. It's generally around 25 to 30%, depending on the month. And the trick is that some of them left the labor force just because there weren't jobs to be had. If you're a restaurant worker, you're not going to necessarily look for a new job because there's nothing, very few places are hiring right now. And those kinds of workers are shown in the green lines on the top. Those numbers have come down the most, but some of the more structural issues are shown in the yellow and the red lines, where we have a large number of our labor force larger number of our labor force is caring for children full time as opposed to looking for work or being actively engaged in the labor market. That's elevated nationally, and it's probably elevated here. And these workers won't go back to work until all the school kids are back in. The next line is the number of people that are concerned about getting or spreading the virus. And again, these workers won't be interested in getting a job until the pandemic is fully controlled. And so there's going to be a labor force stickiness that even as the jobs come back, there still may be spots where it's tight to get labor. And it's going to be a little bit of adjustment factors there. Now, near-term forecast. As we continue the fall and the winter, very little recovery is going to happen. The rate of recovery has slowed considerably since this summer. It's going to continue to be stagnant. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, being the second wave. We always have a little bit of federal election disruption, and that generally doesn't get settled until probably after the inauguration, and consumer sentiment is also starting to wane. The pandemic fatigue is real. It's getting real dark, and people are getting a little bit less optimistic about what's going on. The data are pre-vaccine announcements, and so we'll see if that gives a little bit of a bump. But the next rounds of recovery will be after roughly January. We're going to see a little bit of an uptick to make up for some of this catch-up activity, and then we're going to see an acceleration in recovery starting around the summer, as we get the vaccine really starts to roll out and school reopening becomes a little bit more common. Even with this vaccine, it's very unlikely that we're going to see a full recovery until 2022. It's going to take time to get everything out, and it's probably going to, not only will it take time to get the first gen out, I think there's going to be a little bit of hesitancy. There always is a little bit of hesitancy, and it may not fully recover until the second generation of vaccines. What this looks like in terms of jobs is that regionally, we're going to have a decrease of about 164,000 jobs, and that we won't fully recover all of these jobs until 2022. That's true across the board, both for all of our sub-state areas and for Northern Virginia and most specifically. The story about what happens after is actually a familiar story to us because we've lived through sequestration. The 2023 numbers reflect kind of a pivot that we need to happen. Right, for roughly 3 years, we will be reacting to the pandemic, and then 2023 we'll be in a more normal situation, and businesses will be looking around saying, okay, where are the new opportunities? What's the post-pandemic life look like? And it'll take about a year to get that pivot through. And so 2024 job numbers will be stronger, and there will actually be a better mix of jobs. Overall, the economic situation looks like this, with a decrease of GDP or GRP, gross regional product, of 3.3% in 2020. That's, again, nothing like we've ever seen before. A rebound of 2.4% in 2022. That rebound is a little bit smaller than 2021. The rebound won't really take hold until 2022, the 4.4% bump up. And that reflects not necessarily the number of jobs, but the quality of jobs. Some of the low-hanging fruit tend to be low wage, low value add, and the harder jobs to get back are some of the higher wage jobs. Again, 2023 repositioning through 2024, a little bit of a bump up there. And that is all I have. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Philip to talk about all of the financial things that you need to be considering in the market. And I'm going to switch over to his slides now.
Great. And Jeanette, just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. So with Jeanette's backdrop, and that was spectacular, by the way, and really great information, I wanted to hit on really a couple of slides in this short presentation that we utilize with our clients at Truist. So Jeanette, if you have the ability to flip to page 1, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much. So Jeanette talked about what has happened within the economy, what things look like going forward, and wanted to provide a little backdrop on what that has meant for various asset markets. And when I say asset markets, we're talking about equities, we're talking about bonds and loans, fixed income products, we're talking about commodities. And this year has certainly been unique, something we've never seen before. There's been an extreme amount of volatility, but if you were to ask me in March or April, would I think we would be where we are right now in these various markets, I never would have thought it. But each one of these graphs is meant to tell a little bit of a story. And so we'll talk about these various asset markets. We'll talk about what happened in March and April. A couple of entities had to step in to help. They are the Federal Reserve and the United States government, with both monetary and fiscal stimulus, and kind of where we feel like things are going forward, what's going on in the banking markets, what's going on with businesses, et cetera. So I'll start with the top left-hand graph, and this is a picture of the S&P 500, which is the dark purple line, over the last year. And you remember when we started seeing the graphs, if you looked at, for instance, the Johns Hopkins website, which a lot of people were looking at when COVID really started to spread in the United States, really anything that could be publicly traded was sold. If folks were worried about the values of their 401ks, things like that, et cetera, they were selling equities, they were selling bonds, they were selling funds, et cetera. So we saw the S&P 500 sell off by about 30%, and it did so in an incredibly rapid pace that we had never seen before. And to date, now we are actually setting new highs, and that's for the S&P, for the NASDAQ, for the Dow, et cetera. So you can see the recovery that's happened within stocks. The graph on the top right-hand corner, this is 5-year investment grade and high yield CDS. That stands for credit default swaps. But I will ask people to think of these two graphs as basically the Dow Jones Industrial Average of credit spreads. So if you borrow money from a bank or another lending institution, you will borrow at some kind of core rate like prime or LIBOR or something like that, and then a credit spread will be added to that. So you can see what happened in March and in April. The credit spreads where banks were willing to lend and other lenders were willing to lend increased dramatically. So even if you were a Walmart or an Apple or an Exxon, if you were going out to the markets to borrow money, it was much, much more expensive in March and April because of the pandemic. Similarly, if you look at the bottom, we have various commodities indexes. So metals, ags, crude oil. At one point in May, crude oil actually was settling for a negative value for a very short period of time. And all these markets have recovered as well. So stocks and commodities to this point have almost fully recovered to where we were before the pandemic. Credit spreads on the top right-hand graph, you can see where those are. Before the pandemic, credit spreads were effectively at all-time lows, but we have fought back in a very significant way. And all of these markets continue to get less volatile and they continue to improve over time. So the government and the Federal Reserve in kind of the April timeframe, they both stepped in a really material way. In March and April, a lot of these markets really froze. And when I say they froze, if you were a big company looking to borrow money, it may have been difficult to find someone to do that. If you were looking to sell your company in the mergers and acquisitions markets, those markets effectively shut down. And so the Federal Reserve stepped in and they did a couple of things. And Jeanette, if you don't mind flipping to the next page, I would appreciate it. The Federal Reserve stepped in and did a couple of things. One, they took the federal funds effective rate to zero because they wanted short-term rates and long-term rates, for that matter, to be as low as possible to spur on economic activity. So the graph on the top left-hand corner, LIBOR, Fed funds, even the 10-year Treasury yield, you can see what the Fed did with those. They pushed them as low as possible. So LIBOR today is around 15 basis points. So if you're borrowing what used to be around, call it 2% around a year ago, is now around 15 basis points. So the Fed took Fed funds down to zero, and they pushed the Treasury curve down as well by doing something called quantitative easing, where the Fed actually comes into the markets and spends trillions of dollars supporting the various fixed income markets. And that could be the investment grade market, the Treasury market, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac to support the mortgage market. So in the top right-hand corner, you can see where Treasury yields were a year ago and where they are now. I mean, Treasury yields are really effectively at zero across the curve. So what the Fed set out to do, which is push rates as low as possible, they accomplish that for various maturities, if you're borrowing short-term or long-term. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the Fed's balance sheet, how many trillions of dollars that they have put into the economy by way of quantitative easing. So the Fed stepped in, took rates lower, and then the government utilized the CARES Act, again, trillions of dollars to get dollars out into the system. So all of this stuff has worked. The first beneficiaries of all this action were the public markets. So you can see that where stocks are now. And again, back to some of the examples, the Apples, the Walmarts of the world, they're doing very well because the Fed can simply say, we're supporting those markets. And then they can go out, and they being these businesses, and can borrow for pretty cheap. All of that money that was utilized by the Fed is supportive of small and medium-sized businesses that we are all involved in places like Northern Virginia and Alexandria, but it takes some time for that to work through the system. The CARES Act, in addition to what the Fed has done, that is also working its way through the system. So the point is the markets that immediately felt support were the public markets. And the private markets that we all know very well are recovering, but it has been at a slower pace. So what is happening now? There are a couple of themes that we will see towards the end of this year and throughout 2021. One is The mergers and acquisition markets next year will break all kinds of records. We have an aging demographic of folks who may be looking to sell their businesses. We have folks who had, you heard Jeanette say it, kind of pandemic fatigue, who have been through tough times and may want to sell their businesses. Post-election, there may be a pause on tax policy. We'll see how that works. But if you sell your business, you would want taxes to be lower. So there may be, a period of time where you could do that and garner some support. And the markets are very supportive of this. In addition, there's a huge amount of capital out there looking to be put to work for investment purposes, for lending purposes. So the M&A markets will be significant in 2021. And then to Joe's earlier comments, what's going on in the lending markets? The banks are open for business, without a doubt. We had to step down for a short period of time and to engage in PPP. We had thousands of teammates at Truist that were engaged with PPP, and we were all very glad to do that. But at different times, that kind of took our eye off the ball on near-term opportunities for clients who needed capital for kind of regular way lending or were looking to do things new. So Cassius and other folks within the Greater Washington team at Truist, we're looking to lend. My advice to you would be the following: make sure that your financials are updated as you are talking to banks. Make sure you have a forecast. It is likely, and this is not a change, that guarantees will be necessary, that security will be necessary. But as you're talking to banks, if you're looking to engage in new products or gain capital from a borrowing perspective, have those things ready to go. But since the Fed has pushed rates very low, capital is currently cheap. And yes, credit spreads are a little bit wider, but the core component, the treasury rate component, the LIBOR component of borrowing rates is very low. So banks are open for business and rates are very low, and we're constructive on doing things new. We all had to pause and take care of our businesses in the middle of the year, and everyone at Truist was working with their clients to make sure they were okay. But now things are stabilizing. And when it comes to borrowing, when you're talking to your banks, just be prepped as much as you can to talk about what things look like for the last year and what things may look like in the future. So with that, I will turn it back over to, I believe, Joe, and thank you for the time.
Thank you. And Philip, can you hear me now? Make sure I'm
I can, yes.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Special thanks to Cassius, to Jeanette, and to Philip. We hope that has given you some sense of where we're going. We know there are many questions yet to be answered, and we're looking for the best advice we can get, and we have some of it here. And in terms of, I think, capital for businesses, very important, Philip. And Jeanette, thanks so much for all the work you do all the time to predict where we're going. So now I would like to turn this meeting over to Dave Millard. Many of you on this call know David. He's been a volunteer in this community. He's been chair of the Campagna Center, and he has chaired the Chamber Board during an interesting time called 2020. So David, you are up.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks again to both Jeanette and Philip for a very entertaining and informative presentation. It has, in fact, been a privilege and a pleasure to serve the members of the Chamber ALX as chair these past 11 and a half months. While this unusual year has certainly been beyond compare, I keep trying to identify a adjective other than unprecedented that adequately describes the situation, but I haven't been able to come up with one. I would like to give a special thanks to our board. The Chamber Board and Executive Committee met regularly throughout the year and provided positive and extraordinary support and tremendous guidance to me and Joe and the rest of his great team as we navigated 2020. I'd also like to thank, of course, the chamber staff itself, who literally pivoted on a dime to respond to the new normal back in March. I think our last face-to-face board meeting was March 4th. For some reason, that date still is in my memory. We did manage, however, to start the year with 2 in-person events. Both the chairman's reception, and we were hosted at the new National Industries of the Blind building at Potomac Yards by fellow board member Angela Hartley, as well as the Women's Leadership Forum took place. The 2020 Women's Leadership Forum, of course, celebrated the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment with a dynamic panel. They discussed achieving the best version of themselves through perception, acceptance, and setting boundaries. Then very quickly, in that dime that we pivoted on, starting in March, chamber staff was able to transform itself, which was not easy given that we are, as we all know, a networking person-to-person, face-to-face type organization. But we did start the first of 15 free virtual programming events focused in those early days on topics such as the coronavirus response, PPP, and industry-specific opening standards. The Chamber's advocacy arm and Chamber's Government Relations Committee provided daily COVID information postings and deployed a relief page with resources, business-specific updates, and recordings of the various free webinars that the Chamber was providing. We, of course, continue to meet with City Council and state representatives to discuss businesses' most pressing issues, both before and during the onset of the pandemic. We, of course, moved many events to hybrid formats, including Valor Awards, Best in Business Awards, and the 40 Under 40 Awards. These successful programs allowed us to continue honoring members of our community deserving of recognition. We even live streamed the Valor Awards complimentary to the community to celebrate our heroic first responders. The Best in Business Awards, I might add, involved the staff literally spending almost 14 hours so that event could be live streamed and we could maintain proper social distance standards. The Best in Business Awards did feature, as I mentioned, an all-day streaming event. We honored our very own outgoing, unfortunately, board member, Dr. Tammy Mann of the Campagna Center as the Business Leader of the Year. Inova Alexandria Hospital, Mechanic, Delray Psych and Wellness, Focus Data Solutions, and Bonaventure Real Estate also received our top business awards. And something that's near and dear to our incoming chair-elect, Stephanie Beyer-Kirby, the 40 Under 40 Awards brought hundreds of virtual attendees to celebrate friends and coworkers. And we continue to, each year, I don't know how Stephanie and her team do it, but they continue to identify 40 new up-and-coming young folks that are really the future of the city and the chamber. Like many of your businesses, our chamber has taken on creative initiatives to engage members. The long-awaited return of Leadership Alexandria, which just began in the early fall, and the up-and-coming ALX have proven that necessity is indeed the mother of invention. And I'm sure that Lovey will be in touch with you again, if you haven't already heard, about how to order your copy of ALXopoly. And lastly, our new chair, or former chair-elect, about to be chair, Stephanie Beyer-Kirby, will be our leader next year. I know that our strong current board, along with incoming new board members, will continue to navigate the organization through these challenging times. But before I turn the gavel virtually over to Stephanie, I have a few final recognitions for the year just ending. This year's Member of the Year award is given to the United States Federal Credit Union. This Credit Union has supported the Chamber in many of our programming and events, including leading the charge on 5 events this year. As a relatively new member of the Chamber, they jumped in, and we are incredibly grateful for their enthusiasm, which we know will continue into next year, but especially gave us such a boost this year. I'm pleased to announce also that our committee chair of the year is Elizabeth Lucchese of the Liz Luke team. Elizabeth has led the Chamber's Professional Women's Network for 2 years and supported this 2020 Women's Leadership Forum with a very generous sponsorship. Her work on this committee has left an indelible mark on this group for years to come. Congratulations again, Elizabeth. And I'm also proud to announce that this year's board member of the year is my friend Lawana Russell of Business Management Associates. Lawana has supported the Chamber through active involvement on the board of directors, as a government relations committee member, someone who's generously assisted our staff, and has been an enthusiastic force during the reception auction, as well as our recent membership drive. The final award is the Chairman's Award. And each year, the chair, at his or her discretion, selects an individual to be honored based on the challenges and support provided to him or her over the prior year. And this year, it was a very easy choice for me to give the Chairman's Award to the entire Chamber staff. Joe Haggerty, President and CEO, has led the Chamber through a difficult year with a steady hand, a great sense of humor, and intelligent observations and care and responsibility for not just the staff, but for the Chamber. Maria Shiroki, COO and VP of Public Policy, continued to lead the government relations effort, various women's initiatives, et cetera, again, with a steady hand and a calmness. Stan Brinkley probably was tested in some ways more than almost anyone else, because he had the responsibility as Director of Finance to help us navigate those difficult waters, and has brought us through successfully. And thanks again, Stan. Kay Nacion is Director of Membership. Again, a challenge position in this year, especially given the nature of a business-to-business, personal and interaction, kind of a membership organization. And I'm looking forward to us continuing to assist Kay next year with membership drives. And last but certainly not least, Lovey Padish, Director of Events and Sponsorships, again, had a unique challenge to take that person-to-person event and sponsorship approach to a virtual platform. So please join me in thanking staff and all the other award winners with a virtual round of applause. Getting close to the end here, I would like to take a moment to thank the 8 board members whose terms are ending this year. And while their terms may be concluding, we know that we can rely on their continued support in the future. Charlotte Hall, Aldo Bello of Mind and Media, Jennifer Ferrara of M&T Bank, Sam Giordano of the American Bankruptcy Institute, Tammy Mann, Dr. Tammy Mann, CEO of the Campagna Center, Marianne Martins of the former SunTrust Bank, Alan Schirmer of United Bank, and Tony Vigliani of MLaw. Thank you again. And special thanks, Charlotte, for all of your service over the last 15 years and more, as commitment and your commitment as a former chair of the Chamber and board member for many years. And special advocate, I might add, for our all so important retailers throughout the city. Aldo, Sam, Jennifer, and Alan all served as members of our executive committee. And thank you again for your service. And Tammy, Marianne, and Tony have served for a number of years as vital members of the board to provide guidance and event leadership. And now, in my final act as your 2020 chair, it gives me great pleasure to introduce formally our 2021 chair, Stephanie Beyer-Kirby. Stephanie is a trustee and governance chair of the National Children's Museum and a board member of Inova Alexandria Hospital's Quality Board. Stephanie is also the recipient of Senior Services of Alexandria's Generations of Giving Community Service Award and Together We Bakes, Together We Rise Award. She was most recently a member of the executive leadership team with the Bayer Auto Group family of car dealerships. She has led the chamber for many years as the chair of the Young Leaders Network, has provided great guidance and leadership as chair of the 40 Under 40 Awards event, and during this past year as your chair-elect. I am very, very pleased to pass the baton to Stephanie Beyer-Kirby. So please join me in congratulating Stephanie for taking on this very exciting and challenging assignment for 2021. Stephanie?
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to say a huge thank you to Dave Millard. Your work throughout the year of 2020 was unexpected, and you took the challenge and really led us through a really challenging time. In fact, I would say it was the most challenging time of our 114-year history. Dave has shown a keen interest in the individual hardships that our businesses have faced, which I know will serve him well in his next role as membership chair. His vast experience as a past government relations chair, principal at Avison Young, and engagement on many city boards cushioned the blow of so much of the uncertainty we faced in 2020. The chamber was so fortunate to have your leadership during this difficult time. And I am therefore honored to present you virtually with this gavel to celebrate a year of exceptional guidance and profound influence. I wish I could be there in person to hand this to you, but this is the best we can do in these times.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. I appreciate it.
Yeah. We have assembled a phenomenal executive team for next year, as well as adding 7 new board members for our board. We're looking forward to having their unique and vibrant perspectives guide us and our vision for 2021. So welcome to our incoming board members. We're very excited to have you. I'd like to thank everyone in advance for your work. We know you will continue to do in the new capacity as a board member, and I look forward to serving you all as chair for 2020. Thank you for joining us this morning, and that adjourns our meeting. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.